Thank you, choir. I have been noticing of late that I'm being urged to become a full-time rater, R-A-T-E-R, one who rates. For every experience I have, it seems, for every product I purchase, every call I make to customer service, I'm sent a follow-up survey. Have you noticed this? Yeah, and then if you don't respond, they send you more and more. Tell us how we did. Were you satisfied with your service at retail establishment? This puts my brain and myself into a very specific mode. Wow, I must be really important. I must notice, therefore, every little thing that I did not like. How can someone else do better? How really was it purchasing paper towels, kitty litter, and batteries? Were my needs met? I know this can't be good for my soul. Lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from this invitation to egotism. It's insidious. I want us to notice it. The other day, I called a big medical conglomerate that asked me for a surprising amount of money the other day to try to understand what the charges were for. And the young woman at the other end of the line asked me to hold several times while she tried to get answers to my questions. The way that woman thanked me for holding each time would have been more appropriate for some heroic act, such as if I had saved her from a burning building. Thank you for holding. Thank you for your patience. She went on later to tell me that it was her first week on the job. She doesn't know everything yet. She really isn't trying to hide anything from me, she said. She wants to be totally transparent about why she couldn't understand the charges herself. I wound up feeling a little bit like a therapist, but much more like a kind of a queen before whom a peasant was groveling for her life at court. Please, your liege. Again, this can't be good for the customer service rep or for me, the customer. Being asked to ascend a kind of scaffolding to sit at the top of the hierarchy of approval cannot be good for any of us. It is the opposite of relationship, the opposite of solidarity. It is a very intentional training us away from seeing through the eyes of compassion. What does the Lord require of thee is the perennial question for seekers of the ethical life. In a non-theistic framing, if you prefer, what is it that I should do to be good, to live the best life? Wisdom teachers from across the centuries respond, love your neighbor as yourself. Do not do unto others what you would not have done to you. That was an earlier teaching by a rabbi that Rabbi Jesus sort of flipped a little bit into the framing you're more probably familiar with. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Know thyself. None of these worthy responses to the question of how to lead a meaningful and ethical life mention anything about walking through one's day as a rater and surveyor of others' performances, scanning constantly for their excellence or their incompetence. Notice that all of those responses are almost all focused on doing rather than evaluating. They're focused on an external monitoring of one's own actions in the context of how they impact others. You do this thing. You hold your neighbor's life with a sense of importance and value, just as you do your own, at that same level. You don't do things to anyone else that you wouldn't want them to do to you. You act in ways that are fair, that respect the reality of others, their basic rights, their needs. You stay close to compassion. You remember that you are not the Almighty, and you therefore walk with humility through your life. You know yourself, and that's ancient Greek wisdom. Focus on that. Be responsible for your own stuff so that you don't unconsciously project all your messy content onto others, groups, or individuals. Those are all hard things to commit to. They're the work of a lifetime. All of this rating and evaluating and filling out surveys tempts me away from all of that guidance. They pump me up. They contribute to what the internet calls main character syndrome, which is the delusion that everything is about me. I'm living in a movie where I'm the star, everybody else is a bit player, and that it really matters that my experience at the Comfort Inn was optimal, was a 5 instead of a 3. Notice also the focus on numbers. Well, okay, the Comfort Inn, my key card didn't work on the door when I first arrived, and the remote control was missing. Neither of these things mattered at all in the moment. But again, look how well I am being trained to focus on those tiny inconveniences to give that 3 or 2 rating instead of a 5. I noticed that as I filled out the survey with the highest numbers, that granting the mercy of a 5 rating for the guys at the front desk seemed almost to be an act of rebellion. It was like, human beings make mistakes, to hell with your surveys. Yeah. If we are being asked to evaluate every transaction we have throughout the day, then we begin to see our days as a series of transactions. And by casting an assessing eye on every encounter, we strengthen our capacity to judge and to critique not only ourselves, but others and environments and experiences. And speaking of numbers, of metrics that have become so much part of our lives with technology, how many of you right now are wearing a device on your person or have one in your home that rates you? I'm wearing one right now. Are you? How many of you? True confessions. Okay, right. Do you have a scale at home? A blood glucose monitor? Do you interact with a machine that tells you how fast you're going? Otherwise known as a car? A speedometer on yourself when you work on the treadmill, or the treadmill now conveniently has that, right? And of course our phones. How many apps are we working with that are meant to encourage healthful habits, including sleep hygiene, but that actually may make us a little more anxious, critical, and judgmental when we check in with them? What are they accomplishing for us? Please, let's consider that today when we have some time for reflection on the Sabbath. Please give some thought to whether those health monitoring devices are contributing to a sense of your wellness as a whole integrated being of mind, body, and spirit. I encourage you to take a device Sabbath some day in the week during which you are not tracking statistics about yourself that encourage self-rating and the subsequent judgment that comes along with that. I don't want to speak against quests for health, for tracking of our own statistics that we do with a sense of encouragement and kind of self-coaching. But please note, let us note that all these efforts are aimed at one aspect of our well-being, and that is physical health and metrics of fitness, physical fitness. How many steps did I take? Never towards spiritual fitness. How many steps did I take to respond thoughtfully to a trigger rather than react with egotism and self-certainty? How many steps did I take toward justice equity and compassion in society, in my local community. Those steps are just as important as the steps we take on our daily walk. And yet our ratings and our improvement-obsessed society almost never mentions those other kinds of steps. They are not honored. They are not really acknowledged. We have a conflicted relationship with perfectionism in that we know that it's not healthy to expect it of ourselves or of others, and yet the results of perfectionist behaviors are forever being dangled before us as a shining achievement, and that's such a predicament. If we get all A's on our report card, getting there may have done terrible things to our mental health or to our relationships. But Dad promised you a car if you got it. Or maybe not a car, but just the pride and attention you were always wishing for and yearning for. Get a few B's and maybe a C on that report card after working hard at a school, at your job, at extracurriculars, and you still may have heard, that's fine, but next time I want to see all A's. It starts young. Competition and rating ourselves and comparing and looking at others, rating them and our grades, our bodies, our home decor, our cars, our vacation spots, if we're so lucky to be able to have those, our jobs. And yet we consider ourselves free. That's not freedom. And we should go through our lives in all the categories of judgment. We should go through them and inquire, interrogate them, ask, how and where did I develop my assumptions about what is acceptable? If you do interrogate your life in this way and do so with gentleness, curiosity, and grace, you will very likely discover that there is cultural bias, class prejudice, and actually comical levels in some cases of irrationality behind some of those goals we set for ourselves based on what we thought was reliable information about excellence or wellness. For one example, I have been noticing that researchers are doing, especially black women, are doing research on the BMI, the body mass index, and finding that it is very racially biased. And there's a whole area of research behind that. You can look at that up yourselves. You know, there's nothing wrong about setting that goal for 10,000 steps a day. But did you know that we set that goal not knowing that the number was actually based on a design of a clock created in the 1960s by a Japanese clockmaker? The 10,000 steps was just a marketing device. It's not based on any particular science recommendation. And of course, research reveals that there are great benefits to walking at least, or at a much lesser number of steps. There's also tremendous benefit to walking or moving, stretching, dancing as we are able without counting anything at all. Get out and move if you can, if you're lucky enough, if we're lucky enough to be able to, right? Breathe the air, soak it in. Steps. I introduced this subject to our hearts and minds at this season of the year because of the impending holidays and the accompanying jungle drums of perfectionism that begin as we plan giftings and gatherings and feasting. My siblings and I were just discussing the disruption of the Thanksgiving tradition again this year due to cousins having COVID. And my sister offered to host at her condo in Connecticut, and she said my brother and his 3 kids could come. I can certainly come, and her husband and his 2 adult children will be there. Well, I adore hosting a traditional Thanksgiving meal and cooking it all up, but I don't have enough room in my house for such a crowd. It's also kind of geographically far for everybody to come. And my sister, though, is not so inclined. She's not a big cook. She doesn't love, the big hosting. It stresses her out. She's very open about that. She said via text message, "We'll get a turkey and some sides, and I know it pains thou, but we're all fine slumming it with paper plates and air mattresses and no decor." And I confess, this is my confession to you, this is how I responded to her. "I just think paper plates are soul-destroying." And she responded, "Tell that to the people." She beautifully blew off my perfectionist fussing. She's right. She is good. She has offered hospitality from her heart, is opening up her home and welcoming loved ones in, and she cares about the right things. I, who must have cloth napkins and heirloom side dishes all served in perfect coordination with the perfectly roasted turkey, I, who hover around my guests worrying they might need a drink refill or a clean dessert fork, fall into bed exhausted when my sister, the wise one, asks everybody to help clean up while she takes the dogs out for a walk. She knows what enough effort is. You may be remembering somewhere at the back of your mind that Jesus once said, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Thanks, Jesus. What? What does that mean? That seems like a clear directive. But it's an impossible goal. It seems like a ridiculous thing to say, especially for one so compassionate. So I went back to that remark, made not at all offhandedly by this most enlightened of wisdom teachers, and I see that Jesus didn't just toss that out there to the crowds out of any context. He in fact says it at the end of a sermon, probably the most famous sermon ever given, which we know as the Sermon on the Mount. Comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, the Sermon on the Mount is probably not an address that Jesus gave all at one time. The different sections don't flow together at all like a sermon tries to do. They actually have a sense of kind of awkward tension between them. So they are probably a collection of Jesus' sayings that he gave a lot, and that became, sort of his most beloved greatest hits. It starts with the Beatitudes, the blessed are those section. It segues to that beautiful salt of the earth segment. You are the salt of the earth. And it goes on through various teachings on divorce, adultery, murder, righteousness, all the biggies. It ends with a section about loving thy neighbor and loving those who are really not at all like us, who are not our like-minded community, but are even enemies. And after that is when he says, "Be ye perfect, as God in heaven is perfect." So, in the Hebrew meaning of the word, which I had to research, that term, mushlam, is closer to wholeness. It's closer to that term shalom, that kind of integrity, wholeness of being. Not at all connected to numbers on a scale or the metrics provided to us by an app on our phone. This path to perfection, to wholeness, shalom, is the result of ethical commitments in our living, nothing of which is likely to ever be rated by any observer, but is always evaluated, or should be, by our own conscience. In the end, it's that conscience and being remembered, of course, as a shining name that becomes the final score of our endeavors. Rebel. Resist. Subvert this insidious training towards self-centeredness and perpetual critique. When asked to fill out a survey that rates whatever from 1 through 10 or 0 to 5 stars, Here's an idea. Give everything a 10. Rate everything with 5 stars. In the comments, if there is space for such a human contribution, make a couple of good and positive observations, and then if you must, if it's helpful, you could say, I had a perfectly human experience. The service I received was perfectly human. And again, if it would help, you might contribute your sincere feedback for improvement. Leave room in here, in here, in here, for solidarity, for compassion, for humor, for empathy, for the possibility that our perception is limited and our assessments may even be misguided. Revolt against the tyranny of critical judgment. Use the paper plates. Be ye perfectly human, constituted of compassion, grateful always for the presence of grace.